Thank you, John, very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be to participate in the conference. All right. I'm professor of engineering at the University of Maryland, and I work in the area of systems modeling. And I have been at the University of Maryland since 1983. And my work, my journey in this field in systems modeling, always it brings me to people, because at the very end, whatever we do in engineering, we need to benefit from the social and economic aspects of the problem that we are pursuing and the potential impacts, and bring it in technologies and solutions that we offer. So I do a lot of micro and maybe macroeconomic modeling. At the national academies in the US, there is the Board of Environmental Change and Society. I'm part of that board, as well as there is a roundtable on the risks and opportunities, macroeconomic risks and opportunities related to a changing climate. I do collaborate, globally. I'm appointed at the Department of Commerce as senior economist. I co-direct a center at Tongji University for the last 10 years or so. What I'm planning to do today is cover a notion that really emerged from meetings at the workshop that John convened in August. And it was advanced further through the work at the World Federation of Scientists and the recent meeting in Eritrea. That was also in August of this year. The outline of my presentation here, I'll try to keep it about 25 minutes. I'm going to start with terminology, and I know you are all specialists in this field, but I need to set them to carry the rationale for the notion that will be presented at the very end. I do have a good number of slides, and some of my slides, which is my style, it tends to be rich in content, but I'm not planning to cover all the details on it. I'll be covering or talking about the slide, but I do have the details if there is interest. So I'm going to start with the terminology, then analytics, just basically showing that there are different methods and techniques that people used over the decades, and the notion of rationality and decision-making, primarily from the perspective of rulemaking, the laws that we have and so on. Risk attitude, which is risk aversion and so on, and how it can be modeled. I have one slide on that. Then networks, memetics, control. Then the notion of play, to engage, basically, when I say play, to engage the players. And this is inspired from a poker game and game theory and the use of AI. Then I have concluding remarks at the very end. Let me give you in a nutshell. I mean, this is a style that I tried in the past. Is I'll give you a summary of where I'm heading, and then dive into the details, so that you'll know where I'm heading with all the coverage that I'm bringing from different areas. The theme of this conference is ending wars, and certainly, John, this is very timely with all the conflicts that are raging worldwide. And basically, what I'm trying to do in here is use complexity analytics for dealing with conflict. Because conflicts, they could, if they are not managed properly and so on, they could lead to disasters and major wars. And the steps or what I'm presenting in here, that when we have a complex situation, ideally would like to simplify it, but without losing the essence of it or without losing some very important dimensions. So the first item is to represent the complex situation from the perspectives of the people in conflict, which I'm calling the players. Right? And then to use an honorable value system, which can be very challenging because there are scarcity of resources and it's a very competitive world. And I did enjoy the presentation by Harvey before me. It's the notion of removing ourselves from the national and group identity to a global identity and so on. I mean, all of this honorable value system, how can we make it happen given the personalities, the leaders globally? If you think globally of all the leaders of superpowers and so on, it tell us that maybe we need leaders with vision and so on who could engage the players in a constructive manner, so that at the very end we have a win. And the win will not be a national win, but a global win, and it will lead to peace. Now, one challenging item is nesting, or not necessarily full nesting, but certainly we have conflicts and wars that are nested or overlapping, which will make them, they could be viewed as fractals. And I provide definition for a fractal in there that you are familiar with, that there are self-similarity across different scales. And nesting can lead to resilience, but resilience in the conflict, that we cannot resolve that conflict because of this nesting. I'm going to cover that as well because I think it's very disruptive. And nesting sometimes is fed by leaders who might not have this honorable value system because there is an advantage of maintaining a war. It could be economic advantage and as well as conflicts. So let me start with the definitions. So, I mean, again, I'm going to highlight, in all my slides, I'll highlight the notions of interest, but there are other items that you might find interesting. When it comes to the term conflict, certainly there is some ambiguity in here. Somebody might use the term as to represent a situation. And conflict, you could think of it in terms of people's disagreement. I tend to favor the latter because it's really people's in conflict. The proper, my opinion is that's what we mean in here, and this puts it on a scale of definitions that I put together a few years ago in dealing with persons in resistance. We had at the National Security Analysis Department at Hopkins. I was part of, during sabbatical leave, I was involved in terminology related to persons in resistance. And we come up with this definition, hierarchy of definitions. It's a definition of definitions. What is a definition and how can we set it at the right level? Ambiguity sometimes is desirable, but not always. So we have conflict and cooperation at the national, among nations. Ideally, you'd like to find a common goal. And then if each nation has a goal, but if there are common goals, and conflict arises when one party or one player tries to stop the progress of another, conflicts are not avoidable, right? But war should be avoidable. And all of it comes to resources and resource scarcity. I mean, I have two books that are highlighted in here. I mean, this is on the mind of everybody, the US-China relationship, The Avoidable War by the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, and Destined for War. I mean, you can see that the opposing aspects of it. And ideally would like to make it avoidable war, because it will be disastrous for everybody. Now, let me move to systems. So what is, I mean, again, this is the work that I tend to, this is the field of interest to me. Recently, we organized a workshop for the academies on public infrastructure, where the definition of infrastructure was broadly captured by the economy, the environment, and the people that they serve. And then decisions should account for all of this. So system definition, the origin of the word, which is on the side in there, but it's basically the classic definition: regularly interacting or interdependent group of items. System analysis is trying to understand this interaction and figure out the order or the structure. I mean, always the challenging item is finding hidden orders, right? That could drive the conflict or the war and so on. And this could be broadly captured, all of these elements from the environment, the human societies, beliefs, and so on, technology, economies, and so on, because all of them really do affect the behavior and peoples in conflict. We would like to structure the situation to understand it. And in structuring the situation, everything is driven by knowledge. And knowledge could be done in a hierarchy, in levels of knowledge, but it's important to also understand the deficiency in the knowledge. So always this duality, in my opinion, is very important, because if we have non-reliable knowledge and so on, decisions can be misguided. We need ideally would like to have an organized structure in terms of knowledge, but sometimes we can't figure out all the hidden orders and all the order fully. So we could have some element of unorganized structure. Complicated system versus complex system. The key item is the elements will become agents or actors. So they have their own mind, if I put it that way. Complicated, you don't have that feature, but you have many of those elements. And there are some interactions and so on. So that's the primary difference. But then do you have time? And by the time asymmetry, that if we rely on history, does it really, is it a good predictor of the future? Then they have all the multipliers of reality and perception and deception and knowledge deficiency and ignorance. But going back to complex systems, which is, I benefited so much from the workshop that John organized in August. So there were three definitions that emerged from that workshop. One, and I have them in the top three bullets, that complexity is basically elements forming a pattern with elements reacting to an emerging pattern. So you can see how the elements, they have their own mind, if I may call it that way. Networked adaptive agents. Adaptive agents, it means that they have their own independence in thinking and so on. The study of systems developing from within with outcomes emerging, right? Strategies, I mean, one of the presentations that was there is relying on Chinese philosophy and so on, and expanded beyond that. And I thought that was interesting, that making a stable entity require virtue education. And the word of becoming is a moving harmony, natural flow of the process. It's important to understand the word of becoming, because you could actually capture the internal powers of that emerging system and help it and help shape it where it's heading. Now, applying a force, which is external, let's say, which typically that's what we'll see. You'll try to force a solution by military or economic or whatever sanction, whatever it is. That requires resources, and it requires maintaining that force. Ideally, it's the powers from within to help it emerge in a favorable manner. Economic modeling, I mean, we need to have efficient strategies for whatever we do. The challenge in here, and we are facing this at the present with climate adaptation and climate-related strategies, where you bring people and environment and so on, that you need almost a mix between micro and macro. And some people refer to it as mesoeconomics to understand what is the most economically efficient strategies that we should put forward. I have one slide on system complexity, organized, structured versus non-structured. Structured, there was a program that was funded by the Department of Energy in the US. It's called the ASCII program, and it looked at the structured complexity, physics-based. And they come up with really elaborate models that you could deal with fire propagation in a space station and things of this type. The challenge is limitation in computational power. And even if we have the entire Earth as a quantum computer, and that's what's shown in here, the limitation, based on the works of the Birmerman's physicist, there is a limitation. You can't even do a human vision in full capacity with the retina, 1 million cells. Quickly, you could exceed the capacity of the largest quantum computer that we could ever, using all the resources on Earth. So we have to rely on approximate reasoning. At some point, we could benefit from the computer models and so on, but approximate reasoning through rules, which is the way living systems work, and that's based on the works of the biologist Miller in his classic book in 1987 for living systems, where he came up with these figures that basically you could put an input. This is information input on any living system. It could be a cell, it could be a human being, and you examine their output through actions they take. And as you increase the input linearly, they could keep up with it until it starts to degrade. Then it starts to fall down. And they will end up engaging when they get this input overload by these actions, right? So we have to rely on approximate reasoning in simplifying complex situations, right? Now moving to the next concept, how to deal with complexity. So it's how to simplify it. I mean, we have the, let's say, the real world, and we have the model in here. This is internal, and that's external, if I could separate them that way. And ideally would like a typical loop that people use is called the OODA loop, where you observe, orient, decide, and act, and you cross from the two spaces in here. And you might realize there is a lot of complexity in here. And the question sometimes, is it really in the head of the analyst, or is it truly external complexity? Because, you know, when we bring it internal, we are loading it up with our own biases and emotions and whatever it is, lack of understanding, deficient knowledge, and so on. So you might see complexity that does not really exist, simple problems. And you see that in conflicts where people will say, oh, it's too complex. Well, it's really obvious. the dispute is over a land or dispute over whatever it is. But you could see that, but they are not, sometimes they are not easily separable that way. Now, the other item I'd like to bring in is fractals, right? These are some of the complexity attributes, and the one I'm focusing on is this self-similarity and nesting fractals, which we see in nature. I'm sure you are all familiar with this. But the item that we are doing at the present is we are showing through simulation and empirically by different systems that there is a relationship between resilience meaning persistence of the attributes, right? And whatever attributes are, and fractals. So there is one of the attributes in fractals is you measure what's called the fractal dimension, and resilience could be measured by modified Shannon entropy measure. And you see correlation between them, meaning that when you have nesting, and now it's really intuitively, it does make sense when you have nesting, not complete nesting, but partial overlap, which we have a lot of this when you see conflicts. You try to disturb it meaning you want to advance it to a peaceful resolution, right, by some initiative. But the other levels or scales will end up basically aligning it back to the way it used to be. So this fractal aspect of the nesting, without identifying the players in it, and that's where I'm leading to, that we have to engage the players. So when we have a local solution in a conflict or in a war, where we are engaging the people who are maybe fighting, but we know that the powers are elsewhere as well, then that might not, fully work. And now people try to use, game theory. I'm not planning to go on Nash equilibrium and so on, but I want to show that some of the approaches, this one, we've done a lot of work in this, working in national security studies, missile defense strategies, and so on. And I have some examples in here, preferences on all. And the challenge in here is that the minute you bring it to more than two players, the minute you bring in deception and you don't know what strategy the other player is bringing, it could increase to a level where it becomes not so effective and useful. People try to use, I'm switching to different analytical methods. Bayesian network, where the focus on dependencies. All of these arrows, what you see in the figures at the bottom, it shows one item influencing another item. And we could use probabilistic modeling for it, and people did that. Or another method, people look at state-based systems. You'll say we have a normal state, we have a failed state, and you could make transitions. And you do Markovian models, again, probabilistic modeling. One of the methods that is receiving a lot of traction is complex network theory, and you're looking at the topology in here. So basically, a network, which could be social network, could be engineering, any of the examples that you've seen here, it will be represented by a node and the link. I mean, people call it vertices and edges, but nodes and links, and it could be no direction to the line, or it could have directionality to it. Then we could define what's called the adjacency matrix, how it is wired, and engage in complex network analysis. This was used in communication. You could have shared nodes across domains, which will make them hyper network. And there are performance metrics to it to indicate which node, if I disrupt, it will have the largest impact. I mean, you could translate that into conflicts with the players and the links and so on, and which one should be the focus that could have a lot of influence, the most critical node and so on. Now, I mentioned this earlier in knowledge, that we said that we could have a hierarchy or layered structured knowledge. And in the works of George Clare, who was one of the founding researchers in system science, we put them into layers, that you have the source system, where you have the objects and so on, the data, which is the first layer, measurement of sizes and so on, and then generated attributes, generated meaning computed, it's not measured directly, then an order to it, then some metadata or meta system thinking. Structuring, I think, is very important, but a parallel item, which I don't show here, and I cover in my book on uncertainty modeling and analysis, that in every layer, we need to identify the uncertainties and knowledge deficiencies. Now we could start to bring things together. So I have in here networks, directed arrows, it doesn't need to be directed, but it can be, with that ODA loop. Um, and it could be these are different players, and all of this could be, simulated and so on. And then we could examine resilience of the network and critical nodes, which node that will have the largest disruption. Rationality and decision making. I really enjoyed the presentation of Scott at the very beginning, and he talked about devoted actor and so on. All of these concepts are related, that it's very common in our thinking that we have a red line we can't cross at any cost. And then if we don't cross it, we could do trade-offs. I mean, this is true even in court decisions, and I could show you in the next slide, in rulings related to safety by the Supreme Court in the US. That's the way they dealt with it. They had a red line, you can't cross this threshold if you meet at no cost, because it imposes, it's constitutional, it imposes on the rights of individual, their well-being and so on. And then beyond that, there could be trade-offs and so on, economic efficiency. I mean, we see that in one of my favorite speeches, Churchill at the House of Commons in 1940, we shall never surrender. I mean, this is a red line, right? So basically this thinking is embedded in every human being. Rational decision. I mean, here is a Supreme Court case. It was in 1980. It's a classic one. It's referred in nuclear safety and so on. That when there is a toxin in here, it was a benzene. I think the case was oil chemical industry versus the American Petroleum Institute. And basically, the ruling was, yes, you need to have a scientific evidence for requiring a threshold, right? Then once meeting it, and the issue was whether it can be judgment based. There has to be science behind it, that it's harmful, and then benefit cost analysis can be done after that. So now moving to the next item, memes and memetics. I mean, with the current information technology and the web and AI and fake information and so on, and videos and what's emerging, right? This is going to be another challenge that we have. A meme is basically it's information that propagates, has an impact, and persists, and is self basically it it has this, the evidence is built in it, and once people believe in it, then they could propagate it further and so on. And there are uses, I know, in DoD and others, people try to pursue military memetics for basically affecting population and information and so on. So this is, and this is confirmed with imaging, fMRI, and things of this type. Risk attitude, we just finished a project on wildfire, and it was really related to rulemaking, and this has to do with wildfire in California and due to electric power distribution. And the issue was, how can we account for the risk attitude of being risk averse in justifying higher expenditure than what we have done in the past with the risk neutral thinking. Now, when you have a conflict or an issue, you could approach it that way. You would say, well, I'm comfortable with this level, and this is the risk discomfort level. That's the y-axis. And this is my risk attitude. Risk neutral is when we are up to a certain level of comfort and discomfort. And then we'll have this range, which will become risk seeking, because I'm very comfortable in it, and I could venture. I know the risk very well, and I could take aggressive practices. Or it could be the other way, is risk averse, which we tend sometimes to be in here by buying insurance and so on. So we try, and we looked at the factors that play a role in defining the comfort level. Is the magnitude of the loss, the uncertainty, and so on. There are several factors, and these are at the individual level, and you could aggregate them in a conflict through groups and so on. And perception could play a major role, because reality and perception are not necessarily the same. So all of this, we dealt with it by basically introducing what a notion which is called loss amplification factors, to increase the magnitude of the loss to reflect the risk averse attitude. And we relied empirically on reports that done to Treasury, US Treasury, by the insurance industry on insurance as well as cat bond. And from it, we could determine from the market what is the risk premium that will be paid for having risk aversion for different products. And we use that in the rulemaking that was fed in the commission for dealing with wildfire. Now, when we do system abstraction, you remember that external and internal, the division in there. Ideally, to keep things manageable, we need to abstract what's relevant because at the very end, the what's out there is a continuum that is quite complex and sizable, and it could be overwhelming. So we have the key item in here when we come up with a model is relevance. And when it comes to conflicts and ending wars, players are the most very important starting point, and the influences. And keep in mind that same situation could have totally different perspectives from different players, and even perspectives of the players of each other. So all of this needs to be captured, and identifying the fractals, right? The fractals, because they could be what's the sphere that I should include in here, and did I include enough of the players to make at the very end informed decision. An honorable value system, I think, is the most challenging one because most of the time it is self-interest value system, which is problematic. I mean, with Harvey's presentation moving to the level of global identities, I mean, this is quite honorable value system, right? But how can we get the buy-in from all the nations and the groups and so on? So I think the value system is key in here, and it does require the right leadership, which is globally we are lacking on that front. And then things could be structured by different analytical tools to engage the players for winning peace, as said in the title. But let me give you some interesting thoughts on play the players, which comes from for winning a game. I mean, the classic one is what you see in here is a gambler. He won the 1972 World Series of poker. And the reason he goes by the name of Slim. That's not his real name. When he died, I think there's from the Economist, I think it was in April, he was at the age of 83, but this came in The Economist. I can't find the year in here, but I think it was in like 2000. Basically, they wrote an obituary about him because he played a good number of presidents, including Richard Nixon, drug lords, and so on. He was basically, he could read the cards through the interaction with the players. He's very witty, engaging, and so on. But in here, when I say play the players, it's not really tricking the players. It's more of engaging the players. But the history of the use of poker thinking is there is some history in here by the U.S. presidents. The most noted one is Richard Nixon. And this is all, I mean, there are reports about it and articles and so on. Truman was also a poker player. And I have a list of all the people that I identified, including Churchill, the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill of the US. There is an article by the head of MI6 that came out a couple of years ago, based on the style of Putin as being a poker player, not a chess player. You see, a chess player, you really work on a strategy related to the game, but a poker player will consider the game. The game is important to win, but they are looking at basically the psyche of the players. So in here, and it's documented that Nixon financed his campaigns, elections, and so on, early days through poker games, and he has a strategy for that, how he will play it, and he used it very usefully, according to him, in foreign affairs. Keep in mind that he opened the channel with China in 1979, and it was considered winning strategy, market, and so on. You could, in retrospectively examine it now and say, well, was it that a winning strategy for the U.S.? Barack Obama also, one of the professors, college professors of Richard Nixon was quoted to say this in one of the papers. A man who couldn't hold a hand in a first-class poker game isn't fit for president of the United States. So at the very end, it's about people, right? The favored game by Nixon was the fourth card stud poker. I'm not planning to cover all of this, but you could see that there's an element of bluffing These are the odds of the game. People try to enhance that by introducing game theory with poker and AI. And there has been some interesting development in this, including um, uh, a Norwegian, 18-year-old girl who won the championship by basically using concepts related to game probabilities and AI. There is a tool available for playing poker, basically trained tool based on billions of time uses of the game and so on. I'll stop in here. I mean, I have details on this, but it's a little bit tangential. To conclude things, it's essential to start with the terminology defined notionally in a thoughtful manner, because this will become the foundation for measurement science and the analytics that will follow. Rationality in decision making, this devoted actor notion, and so on, is a very important dimension, and the red lines needs to be understood uh, by each player. The value system, I think is a challenging item in here. It does require the right leadership, the economics, how to come up with a cost-effective strategies, and so on. The modeling, networked intelligent agents, and engaging the players in conflicts and war with consideration of fractals is key to come up with basically strategies with some economic efficiency. Um, I have some text at the very end that presenting the conflict from the perspective of the players with fractals considerations is key. This will lead to engaging the players for winning peace. Winning, keep in mind, it depends on the value system. And how can we, I think that a fundamental item is how can we move that value system to an honorable level that goes beyond let's keep those conflicts or whatever the war because it could have economic benefit. And you could see that whether it's Ukraine, the Middle East, and so on, a lot of value systems that are mixed and all over the place. With that, I'll stop and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and thank you for your attention. In the US, always emerging concepts and so on, they tend to be embraced by DoD, and the reason is the funding, right? So researchers will tend to advance them in that field. But I do see tremendous value in using many of the concepts I covered in here. You could actually flip them from one side to the other, whether it's military, civilian, or the conflict being persistent as opposed to other notions which are more favorable, being cooperation, being persistent, and so on. So any of those concepts, you could actually flip them from one side to the other. But introducing memetics to enhance cooperation and so on is certainly an outstanding strategy, in my opinion. In fact, what in the previous presentation by Harvey, he talked about we need to establish an identity, global identity. There is a classic, maybe you're familiar with this, but there is a book by a historian, Sand, his last name, and it talks, devoted several chapters in which one comes first, the nation or the identity. And of course, the identity has to come first, and you could build up the nation around it. So I think, starting by defining that identity is key. So we could start, talking about how can we create a global setting, but first, you need to have the people to buy in that setting through that identity. What does it bring? Why that alternative, that identity will be better? And memetics could play a major role in this.